Doctrine of biblical leadership. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the concept of biblical leadership, and we saw that it really centers around the idea of responsibility, right? Who holds the responsibility? Who's God going to call to account for the things that take place? So we've seen the importance of responsibility, that God puts people in charge, that God is instilling in people characteristics and responsibility to look after their families and to look after those in their care. And the image begins to develop of that of a shepherd, right? We have that again and again throughout the patriarchs. We have that in David. Of course, he eventually becomes king. So this image of a shepherd, one who cares for his people, one who looks after them, is really that image of servant leadership that we see throughout the pages of Scripture as what we're called to do when we're looking at what is and who should leaders be. We then went from there to the church. What kind of leaders are in the church? Who's the leader of the church? Okay, elders are one of our leaders of the church, but who is the leader of the church? Jesus. Jesus is the leader of the church, not the preacher. No. I don't want it. Jesus is the head of the church. In fact, he is the head of all things for the benefit and for the purpose of the church. So when we look then at leadership, Jesus is the head. Jesus is the leader, right? He's the one in charge. Then we have under him, right, looking after the spiritual needs of the body, we have the elders. And we began to kind of look at what that role looked like, what kind of men we're supposed to be looking for in those. And last week we got about halfway through the list of qualifications. As way of reminder, let's go ahead and read 1 Timothy and then Titus on these list of requirements or of qualifications of an elder. So 1 Timothy chapter 3, starting in verse 1. There we go. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of an overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children in submission. For if one does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for the house of God? He must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up and conceited and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace or into the snare of the devil. So out of this, we get about 12 qualifications of an elder. 4 of these are specific in the way that they're worded and what they are to Timothy. Okay, so we have 12 qualifications of an elder out of Timothy, 4 of which are unique to Timothy. Okay, we then move over to Titus. Titus chapter 1, starting in verse 5. This is why I left you in Crete, so that you would put what was remaining in order to appoint elders in every town as I directed you. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery and insubordination, for an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. He is not arrogant, not quick-tempered, not a drunkard or violent, or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good. He is self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy words taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine, and also to rebuke those who contradict it. For there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers, deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. They must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by their teaching shamefully what ought not to be taught. I'm going to go ahead and end right there because he goes into kind of the context for one of the issues that are going on there in Crete. So out of that we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 qualifications of an elder, if I counted correctly, and I'm not going to say that I did. And 3 of those, I can't count that high, are specific to Timothy. Okay? So these are the qualifications of an elder as given by those. When we put these 2 lists together, then we end up with this. We end up with 14 qualifications, 4 of which are unique to Titus, or 4 of which are unique to Timothy, 3 of which are unique to Titus. Okay? Now you'll notice specifically on number 4, the way that it's worded in each is unique. The same concept is present. Right? So I count those as 1. That's how the math works. So you got to deal with preacher math sometimes. All right. Yes. Children are faithful. It's a good question. We'll come back to that. I think class is dismissed now. Now we're getting into the fun ones today. So we haven't gone through these in order as they are read. We're going through these in a logical, or what I consider to be a logical order of concept. And the first set of qualifications were on number 11 in my list here. So the first 10 really have to do with one's character, right? To be above reproach. What does that mean? And honestly, even the rest that we're going to be looking at today have to do with that aspect of, are you above reproach? That's the question. Are you above reproach? So a elder is expected to be a man who is above reproach. Now, one of the things we talked about a little bit last week is the fact that there are going to be elders who, at some point in their life, were not members of the church. Whether they either didn't grow up in the church, or they did and they then sowed some wild oats and then came back. Regardless, there's going to be a season of an elder's life that is not spotless. And when we look at these qualifications, to some extent it's subjective. Right? What do I mean by that? Well, exactly how hospitable do you have to be? Right? What is your definition of being hospitable enough to qualify as being hospitable? Right? Now, if somebody is non-hospitable, okay, that's a completely different issue, but how hospitable do you have to be in order to be qualified as an elder? Right? So all of these, to some extent, are subjective. Right? We like to treat these like a checklist, as something that is firm and established and black and white and clear. But the fact of the matter is, people are messy. People's lives are messy. So when we're looking at this, we want to uphold the heart of the law for sure, because the heart of what Paul is teaching to both Titus and to Timothy is you need to be looking for men who are of sound character, who will lead and look after the church well. And we appoint the wrong men to our detriment. The only thing worse than no eldership, and I'm a very strong advocate for elders. A very strong advocate for elders. I have worked in a church without elders. I do not recommend it. I do not recommend being part of a church that does not have elders. But I'm also very aware of the fact that across this nation and around the world, there's a lot of churches that don't have elders. And in large part, that's due to unqualified elders. So the only thing worse than not having an eldership is having unqualified elders. Okay? That is the only thing worse. And what you don't want to see is people who view the eldership as power. The eldership is not power. It's responsibility. You have men in your ranks in the church who have the character of somebody who is responsible before God for how they shepherd those they're around. Okay? So we have to understand the heart of this. We have to understand the heart of what Paul is teaching Timothy and Titus, and by link us. So we want to approach and we want to appoint the right kind of people. We're not looking for a board of directors. We're not looking for business-savvy men. We're looking for shepherds. Men who will oversee us, look after us, chase us down for our benefit, say the hard things with love. That's the kind of men we're looking for. We disregard this list to our detriment when we say we know better. Okay? But we also do ourselves a disservice when we make this a letter of law that is so firm and so black and white that we have nobody who's qualified. Right? So we have to understand that. So, go ahead. Yes.
And we don't, because it's either, like you said before, a black and white issue. And it's not, because some of these things, some of these qualifications is, like you said, well, how hospitable, how evenly tempered. Like,
Never, ever, 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 ever have ever lost their temper.
we all boil at different, temperatures.
Right.
So we're all very different. And then the thing about children, right off the bat, we think like 10, 12, 9, 7. But they have children that are 30, children that are in their 40s, that might still be living in their house. And they're grown people with their own minds and their own rights too.
Right.
You know, and how can I press on an elder the ideas that are not, or that he really has no say in the mind of someone who's 30 years old?
Right.
So these things have to be taken into account as well. And then you have, no, he lives under his house and he says that he gets out. Like, what kind of heart do I have that
Right.
I impose that on somebody? So there's a lot of that goes with it. But the very first thing is, it has to be desired.
It does have to be desired. And an elder that doesn't want to serve is going to be a not helpful. That's probably the best way I could put that. Not helpful. And it's not a matter of pride. We'll talk about this issue of pride during the sermon, but when you're qualified, when God has placed the responsibility upon your shoulders to see the need of the sheep, if you are qualified and you walk away from that, you don't desire to fulfill the responsibility God has given you, you're going to have to answer for that. You're going to have to answer for that. And I think that's one of those things where, once again, it's not about power, it's about responsibility. As God placed you in a position to where you're walking away from that responsibility that God has given to you to oversee and to shepherd those you're among, to disciple those you're among, right? And that's a heavy responsibility. And they do have to desire it. They do have to desire it. But they also, in desiring, is a feeling of that responsibility. A feeling of that responsibility. Okay, so let's get into these. Number 11 on my list is able to teach. This is both in Timothy and in Titus. This is an important attribute of an elder, to be able to teach. This is not saying that he needs to be a public orator, nor is it saying that you have to enjoy his classes. Okay? Teaching is an art. Some people have it, some people don't. Some people are really good preachers and not very good teachers. And you're like, yeah, I know I'm one of those. Right? Some are really good teachers and not very good preachers. And some of you others are going, I know some of those too. Right? So it's not about the enjoyment of the audience, of the teacher, or of the public speaker. Right? That's not what's being communicated here. What's being communicated here is the importance of understanding what is sound in doctrine and the ability of that person to come alongside a fellow Christian, a non-believer, and to be able to communicate clearly what the truth is. That's what's important in this. So it's not about, do you like so-and-so's teaching style? It's not, does he put you to sleep when he preaches? It's a matter of, does he know sound doctrine, and can he either in public when he must, it may make him extremely uncomfortable, but is he able to communicate truth either in a public forum and especially one-on-one? Right? So that is the qualification here. Is he able to clearly communicate and explain the scriptures to an individual? Right? So it's not about public speaking, it's not about oratory, it's not about being engaging, it's not about charisma. It's about being able to communicate the truth and to defend the truth. And I think we see that very clearly in Titus, right? And what we just read in Titus. Let me jump back here to, no, I went the wrong way. Titus, so verse 9, he must hold firm to the trustworthy words taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and to rebuke those who contradict it. Right? For there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers, deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. They must be silent, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain what ought not to be taught. Okay, so Paul to Titus is going to write an additional 6 verses to explain why this one is important. He's going to go on to explain the issue they're currently facing and why an elder should be one who can defend the doctrine so that they are not allowing shameful gain for these teachers to be able to continue. Right? So they are the gatekeepers of truth in the local church. That's one of their main roles, to be able to communicate and defend sound doctrine. Okay? Now, that might mean that the elders allow something you don't like because they think that it is within the means of sound doctrine. Now, that may not mean that they hold it on every point that you do. It may also mean that they hold to a stricter view of Scripture than you do. The question is, are they seeking to be biblical? Are they coming up with sound biblical arguments for why they're holding that position? It's well researched, it's well thought out, it's not rushed. If it's within reasonable, we need to submit to it as best as we can, as far as we can. Right? So the elders are there for our benefit as our shepherds, to look after us and to make sure that sound teaching is being taught. That's one of the most important roles that they have. So the elders are going to be the ones who look at a guest speaker and say, okay, is this somebody we can trust to come in and speak to our congregation? Right? They're going to be the ones who are listening in on the teachings that are going on, and who then step in and say, okay, that was not quite right. We need to correct that. We need to clarify that. They're the ones who then get the questions. Well, why are we doing this? Or why are we doing that? And they need to be able to come to the Scriptures and say, here's why. Right? So being able to teach is that ability to hold sound teaching and walk people through what is proper. Right? So that's the role of an elder when it comes to that one. All right, let's get back to our nice long list here. Okay. Number 12. The husband of one wife. You know, I think we're out of time. It's just going to get worse from here. All right. What does it mean to be a husband of one wife? There's all sorts of debates. We're getting into those issues that disqualify or seem to disqualify the most amount of men. Right? A lot of these others, you'll have them in varying qualities, and you get to this one, and it seems to be a black and white, you're in, you're out. Okay? Once again, we want to follow the heart of this. We don't want to just follow the letter of this. Okay? What is the heart behind this commandment, of this instruction, of this quality? It's what kind of man is he? A one-woman man is literally the words used. A one-woman man. If a man has been married to only one woman, but he's checking every woman who walks by him out, he's making passes at everybody, he's had multiple affairs, he cannot seem to keep himself in line, he is disqualified. Okay? I don't care how many times you've been married. I don't care how many times you have repented. If you do not have the qualities of a man who is devoted to one woman, you are disqualified. Okay? I think we do ourselves a, and this may be unpopular, but I think we do ourselves a disservice when we do not understand the value that marriage has in being able to look after an entire congregation. Right? There is a quality and a refinement that comes through marriage. When you have somebody who lives with you day in and day out and is able to say, yeah, you got a log in your eye, buddy, and you better fix it. And long-sufferingly seeing every part of you, bad breath and all, will call you out and call you to righteousness. Right? So a man who can't seem to keep a woman around, right? Women just keep divorcing him. There's a problem there. Right? There's a quality there that is problematic. Right? There is also something gained in having that wife who has walked beside you through life and helped to refine you as you've refined each other together. So he should be married. He should be married to one woman. Now the question then becomes, well, what if he was divorced at one point? What if that was before he became a Christian? Okay, well, once again, we're looking at the heart of this as well. Is he a man who's devoted to one woman? Was that part of who he used to be and is not part of who he is today? Has he been faithful to one woman for the last X amount of years and he made some mistakes in his youth? Those are things we have to weigh. Those are things we have to wrestle with. The other thing that will come up is what happens when you're widowed. When somebody who you've walked beside is taken from you. Does that then disqualify you? What if you remarry? Does that mean, well, now you've had two wives, right? Once again, we come back to the wording here. It's a one-woman man. We're talking about devotion. We're talking about loyalty. We're talking about his control of himself, the partnership that he has. I think there's value that a elder has when he has a wife beside him. There's not a question about that. She adds to the eldership. She brings something to the table. She helps to shepherd the flock. However, I have known elders who have lost their spouses and who have continued to serve. And I see no problem with that because he's a one-woman man. He's working through his stuff. He's dealing with life. And if that man happens to come across another woman, he is free to remarry. And he is still a one-woman man because he's devoted. So once again, when we're walking through this, there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of judgment. Not that we need to be judgmental, but that we have to discern what kind of man we're talking about. Right? He does not become disqualified, in my opinion, because he loses his spouse. Nor does he then become disqualified again because he decides to remarry. What does disqualify him, and I will hold this hard, is when he's a womanizer. When he is not loyal.
I think it comes down to one thing that's faithfulness.
Yes.
That's what it is. The faith that you have with that one woman, the faith that you have with that one man. Because we have females can be deacons as well, right? And they have to meet these qualifications as well. And so these things fall. I know I'm throwing everybody to the weeds, but it comes to faithfulness, and that's the key. Because if the marriage represents the church and God, we are supposed to be faithful to Jesus and have no other in our hearts except Jesus. We believe in Jesus, we follow Jesus, we love Jesus, and Jesus should be the only thing in our hearts.
Right.
And when I'm married, because I talk to the boys, well, when you're married, there's only one woman in your heart. That's it. You look around, whatever, but there's only one woman in your heart.
Yep.
And that's the only woman you're supposed to be faithful to, the one in your heart. And when we come to God, we should, Jesus in our heart, and only Jesus should be in our heart. And a womanizer, like you were pointing out, really he has no woman in his heart.
Yep.
He really loves no one. The only one that's in his heart is himself,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So he can't be, he's being faithful to himself, but he's not being faithful to anyone because there's no one in his heart.
Right.
And as believers, we sometimes fall short because we allow other things to go into our hearts and push Jesus out. And we have to also remember that we too are sometimes a little bit broken and we need help and aid. People need to understand this. And I've seen it where it's just so down, it's like, no, and you were married and this. And there's a lot of struggles, but he's a good man. He prays, he does, he works. I mean, 30 years ago he was one person, but this is a totally different person. He has
Yep.
really matured and he knows the gospel. He knows the gospel. He knows, and he can help you out with that.
Yep.
And I think that sometimes as sitting here, it's just so easy to just X things out.
Yeah.
Not taking into consideration grace.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's true. And these are not easy to navigate. Right? These are not clear to navigate. These are challenging things. And there's a variety of positions held. And if you asked 100 people, you'd get about 200 answers, right, on what is the exact way this should be done. It's a challenge. But what we have to keep in mind, first and foremost, is the heart of this command. What is Paul trying to communicate to both Titus and to Timothy about the kind of man who is qualified to be an elder, that God would call to be an elder? Right? We're not talking about perfection, we're talking about the quality of his character, and then we move into, a discernment thing of if a elder does not have a living wife beside him, then is he lacking perspective in the moment to shepherd the flock? I think that's a valid perspective to say, I don't have the perspective that I used to have, and I needed that, and I need that, right? Or just the heartbreak that follows. There is reasonableness for this. This is not easy, so don't hear me and don't take away from this. Well, Michael said this, and this is cut and dry and easy. This is not easy. It's not easy in the slightest, right? And we're talking about challenging discernment topics. And the next one is even harder, because the next one is loving or believing children, right?
Also, the culture within this period of time, polygamy was a very common thing. And
Yes.
it was accepted, even in the Jewish culture was accepted. So that also has to take a lot into account because of these things. When it's like, we want to cut the old way of thinking. There's this new way of thinking. That has to be taken into consideration. Because everybody, well, Solomon had all these wives, and David had, yes, that's an old way of thinking.
Yeah.
We're coming into a new world, in spiritually speaking, a new priority, a new state of mind. That's no longer part of it.
Right.
And there's a division that before Christ and after Christ think that sometimes people just don't seem to understand. And they always bring up Solomon, and they always bring all these characters from the Bible that they were polygamous. Yes,
No.
but there's a difference. And by saying this, it's like we're cutting that off. That is of the old.
A new way of thinking.
Of the new.
Yeah. Definitely. Definitely. All right. Managing your household and your children. Covered in both Timothy and Titus. Number 4. The instructions on this out of both Timothy and Titus are different. And this is a challenge. In the same vein, I'm going to do some reading here because I did a lot of work to put my notes together, and I don't want to misspeak on this one. In the same vein that a husband of one wife looks at his household and his children, you can put on the fruit in public before us that you cannot at home. When we see problems in your marriage and in your children, there are probably problems in your character as well. Things that you're able to hide from the rest of us. I'll remind you that an elder is a shepherd, and he cannot shepherd if he cannot shepherd his own family, he probably cannot shepherd the church of God either. Now, there are times when you might not be able to reach your children, but that has probably something to do with past mistakes. I'm not saying that you're a bad Christian or that in some way you're evil. I'm saying that we're looking for shepherds, men who are above reproach. Okay? It's important also for us to remember that children are indeed free agents. They make their own decisions. They value and listen to the words of their father. They're free agents. So what does that exactly mean when you manage your own household well? I'm thoughtful of the proverb, right? Train up your child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That is not a promise. That is a rule of thumb, right? Me. These are my words. Yeah. This is not scripture. This is this is my notes. I want to make sure that I'm communicating this clearly because I don't want to muddy the water any more than I would do if I'm just speaking off the cuff like I normally do. So it's important to remember that we do not control our children in every decision that they make, right?
But isn't there a certain age where you should?
Yeah, no, definitely, right? At different points in time, there's different amounts of control that a parent has over their children, right? But at some point, they leave home and they make their own decisions. They go against their parents' wishes, right? And it's important to remember they are indeed free agents, right? So we're looking for both the heart and the requirement here, right? We're trying to figure out how do we thread this needle. Right. somebody who can shepherd us, somebody who can lead us, somebody who we can respect. Right? And we're looking for how does their children respect and view them.
No matter how much my mother told me at the age of 7, I still put the knife in the electric socket.
Was that shocking to you?
It turned everything off. There's the sickness out of me, thank God I didn't die. But no matter, I'm 7, 8 years old. I'm gonna do what I wanna do.
No,
You know, you may say, control is an illusion.
it is. It is.
You may set bad boundaries and whatever, but I wanted to put this knife into that socket,
Yes, yes.
and I did. And no one had any control over that.
Yeah. One of the things years ago, it was really popular, was Super Nanny and Nanny 911. And Alyssa and I watched a lot of those episodes before we had kids and as we were raising Ella and Nikita. And then one of the things we noticed, I think there was one episode where there was not a problem in the marriage. One episode where the nanny did not sit husband and wife down and say, when you two get your act together, this will straighten up. I think I can remember one episode from both series where that was not the case. Every other case, these brats of children that the parents were both sending up flares, she'd get both of them together and she'd have harsher words for one of the two, but she had harsh words for both and said, you two get your act together. And until you get your act together and you both start respecting each other and you start working as a team, this isn't going to get better. And she was right. So this issue is a major red flag, symptom flare of something that you can hide in public, but you cannot hide in private. We disregard this at our own peril. But we do have to remember they are their own agents. They make their own decisions. All right? And I know I sound like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, but it's important that we understand this concept. Because this is not easy. All right? Paul tells Timothy that an elder's kids will be one who obeys and respects him. They value and listen to the words of their father. Kids who disrespect, disobey, and generally do not care about their father will not listen to him. Right? That is a warning sign of something going on at home. It could just be a season of life. But only time will tell. But if it is a standard attitude or an attitude that is getting aggressively worse, then that is a warning sign that something is not right at home. The logic is sound on this. If a shepherd cannot shepherd his own children, how can you be trusted to shepherd the rest of the church? If your children are rebelling against you, then what in your life is causing them to do that? It goes back to this issue of being above reproach. It goes to the capability of an individual as a shepherd of his flock. It is very similar train of thought that Paul says to Titus. He also addresses this kind of persons in their children. If your children are wild and unruly, if they are profane and lawbreakers, then it calls into question why and where they learned it. Was this something in your life that led them to do this? Did you fail to shepherd them? Now, everyone has their own person. We all have free will. Not every disobedient children is the parent's fault. But there is truth in the fact that the home is a good thermometer of what is going on. I believe that Paul and God train of thought here is sound. Now, the real question and debate is not, is your children, the real question and debate is your children a rebate? But what does it mean? Okay. One of the questions that we have to ask is, what is the character quality of the child? Right? We're looking for somebody who has raised their children whether they've been in the church all their life or not, have they raised their children to be law-abiding, respectable, successful members of society? Right? That's really the question. Right? When somebody does not do that, when they raise a hooligan, right, it raises the question of what kind of character does that person have. And I can think of several leaders of the Bible who are disqualified on this account to be leaders. Samuel, when the nation comes to you and says, we don't want your children to lead us because they are corrupt, that's a problem. That disqualifies you.
It's not First King Samuel.
The same thing goes for Eli and his sons. Disqualifying. Pure and simple. Right? Before we even get to the question of, and the big debate as to whether or not they have to be believing, what does believing mean? Right? We're looking at the quality and the character of the child and what has been instilled into them. Right? David. He would not qualify. Right? So we're talking, and this is one of the reasons I married my wife, going back to the previous one. I knew that my wife would not let me abandon my family. I knew that she would not let me be one of those ministers, and there is a number of them throughout the years, who have raised great ministries, been devoted to their work, and abandoned their family. Right? You have to do the work in order to have the fruit at home. Right? So the real question is, what does it mean to be a believing child? At what point in their lives must they be believing? These are not easy questions with simple answers. Now, I yield to elders' judgment on this point, but I will make a few passing comments for you to consider. The Greek word for believing, which is often understood to communicate faithfulness to the truth of the gospel, can also be translated as faithful or trustworthy or people of sound character. This would fit with the context of both Timothy and Titus. It also does seem a little bit odd that out of a list of personal qualities, the issue of an elder has direct control out of his child's faith and what he believes. That he would be held accountable for the free will of his child or lack thereof. Can anyone hold themselves accountable ultimately for what somebody else believes? So I think when we look at this issue, it's important that we remember that we're looking at a very complicated situation. I am very firm that this is a very important quality. I think this shows us a lot about the character and the quality and the life that an elder has lived when you look at his children. I think an elder can also be very distracted when he's concerned about the spiritual welfare of his children and they are not in the church. And he may be distracted looking after his own children and trying to seek to bring them to the Lord and unable to focus upon the work of the Lord in the local church. That's a reasonable position to be in. I think it's also reasonable for a parent to have allowed their children to think for themselves to a point that mom and dad don't necessarily have the ability to speak to that issue anymore. Right? They have been such a consistent drip of information and nag on the issue of be a Christian that they've lost the ability to move the needle. And it's going to take somebody else to bring them in and to God. Right? So this is a complicated one. Right? It's a very, very complicated one. I think it is worth noting that the word believing can also mean of sound quality of character. Right? And once again, when you look at the kind of child. I've also known some people who say have adopted children, and the adopted child, entered the family when they were older, and due to previous life experiences and challenges and some bad mistakes and things that happened, that child has gone down a very bad road. And it breaks that parent's heart. I don't think that's on the parent. I don't think that makes them a bad shepherd of their child or necessarily disqualify them from shepherding the flock of God. But that is an issue of discernment. And it is not a simple one to look at. Yeah, so an apostle is one sent with authority, is the technical definition. Right, so the disciples, the 12 disciples, 11 of them survived to see the church. An additional one was appointed, and then Paul. Right. And to our knowledge, Paul was never married. So he wouldn't be qualified as an elder. But we do have, say, Peter and John talking about the fact as a fellow elder. And what we see is as the apostolic age ends, the truth of the gospel has been communicated, the church is established, they move from an apostolic role to an eldering role. And I think it's interesting that they don't see that as a demotion, they see that as a change of role. And that the church is then led and guided and governed by a group of elders. And we have that plurality. Okay. Number 14, not a recent convert. Only talked about in in Timothy. Makes a lot of sense, right? You don't want a baby Christian, no matter how old and how many gray hairs and how good with money or how good with whatever. They need to not be a recent convert. They also need to not just be fresh to the congregation. Okay, now I want you to think about this. If this church is going to appoint elders in the next year, the elder is already here and among us. Right? We might be able to appoint an elder in 2 years who has not yet moved in among us. But we cannot appoint an elder who has not been among us, because he needs time to get to know us, to get to know the culture, to get to know the people, right? I would say a year is minimum on that, right? So it's not just the concept of a recent convert. I think we understand the need for being theologically sound and firm in the faith and not brand new to this whole Christian thing. But we also have the aspect of not just being willy-nilly new and not knowing anybody, right? They need to have time to get to know the congregation before they assume that responsibility of overseeing and speaking into our lives, which is another reason why I am not the pastor, I am the minister, right? One thing I will make note of, and I am over time, but I don't think I have enough material to it not just be a big long debate session of us talking about elders next week and going through this list and everybody giving their 2 cents. So one other point I want to make on this. How are elders to be appointed? Often the tradition is that they're voted in, right? Often, because we're Americans, right? We vote for president, and we vote for our electors, and it's our culture, right? The church is not a democracy. We have a king, right? So when we look at this issue of elders, who is appointing elders in Timothy and Titus? Timothy and Titus. Timothy and Titus are establishing elderships as missionaries. They are the ones given the responsibility to look at the character and the quality of these men, to judge by their list, and to say, okay, these are the kind of men I need to be appointing and looking for the shepherds amongst them and acknowledging the shepherding and bringing them into a group to shepherd and lead the congregation. So it's the missionary minister of the congregation who is to be looking at this list, looking at the men, and finding out. I think there's a lot of wisdom to say we are looking at these men. If there is a problem with these men that you know about, please let us know. What is not biblical is for it to then be elected. Now, what we don't have is any sort of precedent on what happens once an eldership is established. I would not say that it is the minister's role to appoint the next round of elders. I would say the elders are the ones who then appoint the next round of elders and bring in additional elders. That those men, once given that responsibility of shepherding the flock, would then be the ones who have the responsibility to be raising up the next round of elders.
Timothy and Titus, they just got the ball rolling, as they say.
Right.
But once it's been established, they have to continue.
Yes. Yes, and I think it should be a self-replicating thing. I have heard of elderships who are like, oh, we can't appoint this guy to the eldership because if he does that, or if we do that, he's going to just, make the church so much more, serving to the community. Oh, there's some heart check on that. That's a whole nother issue, right? It can be an issue of power, right? This can be problematic, but it's not about voting in elders. And I think you have to be careful. And I've applied at places to preach where they didn't have elders, or they were quickly about to lose their eldership because, one guy was in hospice and the other guy was in the hospital, and you're like, yeah, this isn't good. What are you guys doing to replace your eldership? Yeah. So you're going to ask me, a young man who knows nothing about you, to come in and then appoint your eldership and raise up elders from among you. Yeah, that's not going to work. That dog don't hunt, right? So there's a number of problems, but we're not to vote them in. I think we have a precedent for the minister or the missionary appointing the first round of elders, and then the eldership continuing to appoint additional men to the body. All right, I am over time. I appreciate your guys' attention. I bid you all adieu.